You felt that wave of relief hit your chest the second those headlights showed up on that dark road. You exhaled. Maybe you even cheered out loud on your couch, because finally, after everything, Chris made it out. But I need you to stop right now before you keep watching this video and answer one simple question, a question almost nobody ever asks. How does a TSA agent, a guy whose entire job description is scanning luggage inside an airport terminal, track down alone in the middle of the night, with no GPS, no witnesses, no verifiable lead whatsoever, an isolated rural property with no address, no sign, nothing, and show up at the exact precise second Chris is about to die? Think about that for a second. Rod didn't have the address. Rod didn't have a map. Rod had, at best, paranoia and a hunch. And yet he shows up, driving a squad car he technically isn't even authorized to use, with the timing of a summer blockbuster, to save his best friend 1 second before the knife comes down. That's not a coincidence. That's the textbook structure of a rescue delusion, the exact kind of fantasy a collapsing brain builds when reality has nothing left to offer. And that is exactly what this video is about. Today, here on Fractured Plot, I'm going to show you, scene by scene, clinical proof by clinical proof, that Chris never actually left that house, that Rod's rescue, the getaway down that dark road, the bloody revenge against the Armitage family, all of it is the final hallucination of a mind that is, at this exact moment, being opened up by a scalpel. The real ending of Get Out isn't freedom. It's the eternal silence of a consciousness trapped forever inside a body that no longer belongs to it. I know that's a hard thing to hear. I know you want to believe in the hero who makes it, the guy who finally beats the system that tried to swallow him whole. But the human brain, when it's confronted with irreversible pain, with the mutilation of its own identity, doesn't accept the ending. It rewrites the ending. And that's the exact line separating a happy ending from a defense mechanism. A happy ending happens out in the world. A defense mechanism happens only inside a skull, in the last second before everything goes dark. Think about that opening party scene too. That stiff, smiling garden gathering. The bingo game the family sets up as cover for the actual bidding process. Guests circling Chris like appraisers at an estate sale, touching his arm, commenting on his frame, his genetics, his stamina, as if he were livestock at auction rather than a guest at a party. Every single one of those interactions plays, on first watch, like awkward, cringeworthy social horror, the discomfort of being othered at a party full of strangers. But rewatch it once you know where this is headed, and that bingo game stops being a cover story. It becomes a ledger. Each numbered card matched to a silent bid. Each polite compliment, a line item in an inventory. The horror was never hidden. It was priced right there in plain daylight, while a string quartet played somewhere near the lemonade table. And before you write this off as clickbait theorizing, stop and notice something the film itself hides in plain sight from the very first frame. That cold open shows a young black man getting snatched off a quiet suburban street at night, alone, hooded, dragged into a white car. There's no witness, no security camera, no neighbor stepping outside to check the noise. The movie is teaching you from minute one that nobody documents what actually happens to these bodies. Nobody records the truth. So if nobody was there to witness the abduction that opens this story, why would you so easily trust the getaway that closes it, filmed with that same total absence of witnesses, that same empty road, that same complicit darkness? Think about Chris's job, too. The fact that he's a photographer, a man who makes his living freezing a single instant of reality so it can't be twisted or denied. And it's his camera flash, purely by accident, that cracks Logan's trance wide open at the garden party. The first possessed man we see up close. Light, a sudden sensory jolt, is the only thing strong enough to rupture the sunken place, even for a second. And if a simple phone flash can do that to somebody else, imagine what the brutal physical shock of a scalpel-splitting scalp, of a bone saw touching skull, would do to Chris's mind hours later, strapped to that exact same table. Look at the van ride at the start of the film. Chris is still conscious, still technically in control, even under hypnosis. Georgina, the housekeeper, cries without knowing why. Walter sprints through the woods at night with a speed that makes zero sense for a middle-aged groundskeeper. Those are the first cracks, showing between what the body does and what the mind underneath actually wants. And it's exactly in that gap between body and will that the real horror of this film lives. It was never about being chased. It's about being a passenger inside your own flesh. Now I need you to understand, with real clinical weight, what the sunken place actually is. The movie treats it almost like a poetic metaphor, a dark shadow where consciousness just floats. But inside the neurology of trauma, the sunken place is one of the most precise cinematic representations ever put on screen of a condition combining total sensory deprivation with fully conscious motor paralysis. There's a real, documented, terrifyingly rare condition called locked-in syndrome, where the patient is completely awake, completely aware, processing every sound, every word, every indignity happening around them, but unable to move a single muscle, except, sometimes, their eyes. Imagine hearing a doctor say you won't survive the night, hearing your own family sobbing beside your bed, and being unable to scream that you're still in there, that you hear every word, that you feel everything. That real medical nightmare is the exact clinical blueprint underneath the sunken place. When Missy Armitage stirs that spoon against the teacup, she isn't just hypnotizing Chris. She's literally pushing his consciousness down into a sensory cell, a vacuum with no temperature, no outside sound, no motor control at all. There's only the fall, the endless fall, and one small distant screen, a cold little rectangle showing your own body acting without your permission, laughing when nothing is funny, crying when there's no visible pain, bowing, obeying, smiling at Rose, while somewhere in the dark, a voice screams a scream that never makes it out. Notice how the camera frames it too. Every time Chris drops into the sunken place, he's shot from far away, tiny, floating in a weightless black void with no floor, no wall, no point of reference, while the only sharp image left is a small rectangle of light way up above him, like a television screen seen from the bottom of a well. That's not just style. That's the exact visual translation of what clinicians call extreme depersonalization, the sensation of watching your own life from outside, small, distant, like you've been shoved into the audience of a theater where the stage is your own face. That's the actual horror of the sunken place. It was never the darkness itself. It's being forced to witness, with total clarity, your own body being operated like a puppet by a will that isn't yours. It's ego death, in the most clinical, most devastating sense of that phrase. In psychology, the ego is the structure that stitches perception, decision, and action into one continuous thread called identity. Strip away the decision and the action, but leave the perception fully intact, and you don't get a zombie. You get a perfectly lucid prisoner locked inside a cell made from their own skin. There's actually academic language for this exact style of control, something the philosopher Michel Foucault described decades before anyone ever wrote a horror script. He called it the docile body, a body trained and monitored and disciplined until it obeys automatically. No visible chains required, because the surveillance has already been installed on the inside. The Armitage family doesn't need to physically chain Chris, because Missy's hypnosis already welded the chain directly onto his brain, an invisible chain that responds to a verbal cue before his conscious mind even registers what his own body is doing. That's not pure fiction. That's the exact logic of every documented control system in human history, just compressed into domestic horror, wrapped in iced tea and a piano playing softly somewhere in another room. And that exact architecture of horror repeats, amplified, multiplied, in the film's surgical climax. Look at Jim Hudson, the blind art dealer who wins Chris in that silent phone auction, that quiet raised hand, no words spoken out loud. Jim doesn't want Chris's body for its youth or its strength. He specifically wants the eyes, the photographer's talent, the exact way that particular brain sees the world through a lens, which means, to the Armitage family and every guest at that party, Chris was never a person. He was always a catalog of sellable attributes, a bundle of detachable qualities, as if you could somehow separate a gift from the soul that produced it. And that exact kind of fragmentation, treating a whole human being as a collection of reusable parts, is precisely the condition that primes the final delusion Chris's mind is about to build. Because if you've spent your entire life being valued only for useful pieces, the only rescue fantasy that makes sense is one where you, finally, violently, take total ownership of your own body back. Notice Dean Armitage at dinner, bringing up, unprompted, his father losing to Jesse Owens at the Berlin Olympics. He tells it like an old family wound that never healed, and it only becomes genuinely disturbing once you place it inside the full context of the Coagula procedure. That grandfather didn't just lose a race. He spent a lifetime obsessed with the idea that black bodies possessed a physical gift he could never have. And decades later, his family turned that obsession into an entire surgical pipeline, a generational cycle where envy of equality becomes, quite literally, a surgical plan to steal it, which means Chris isn't the first victim, and somewhere in his own mind, under partial anesthesia, there's an echo of understanding that he's just one more repeated link in a chain that's existed for generations. And it's that crushing realization, being part of something bigger and older than his own single life, that fuels the almost mythic scale of the revenge fantasy his mind builds minutes later. A revenge big enough, in fantasy, to avenge not just himself, but every body that came before him. If you felt that same paralysis, that same suffocating grip of this hidden truth, don't let your own awareness sink the way Chris's did. Drop a like right now, subscribe here on Fractured Plot, so we can keep our grip on reality together. And tell me in the comments if you ever suspected that Perfect Ending was too clean, too fast, too convenient to be real. Remember the shoebox Rose keeps hidden in her closet, that private archive of photos and videos of every previous victim, other men and women who went through this exact same process before Chris ever did. Chris finds that box, flips through those photos, sees the same terrified expressions on people who once believed for 1 second that maybe they'd be the exception, that maybe the love was real. That discovery is the single most violent emotional trigger in the entire film, because it isn't just betrayal, it's documented, photographed, statistical proof that the pattern always repeats, always ends the exact same way. No exceptions. And a brain that just processed undeniable proof that no different ending exists for people like him is exactly the kind of brain that, minutes later, under partial sedation, desperately invents the one and only exception. There's a real, documented medical phenomenon called intraoperative awareness, or anesthesia awareness, where a dosing failure leaves a patient fully conscious throughout an entire surgery, feeling every incision, hearing every word from the surgical team, processing every instruction given about their own open body, while the paralytic drug administered alongside the anesthesia blocks any movement, any scream, any physical sign that something has gone horribly wrong. Survivor accounts of this phenomenon describe the exact sensation this film turns into racial and existential metaphor, being fully present, fully lucid, and completely powerless, locked behind your own closed eyes while the world keeps acting on your body as if you're already gone. That's the same architecture of horror, documented by actual medicine, that Peele recycles and amplifies into the Sunken Place, except instead of lasting a few minutes until the dosage gets corrected, for Chris, that intraoperative awareness never gets corrected at all, because nobody on the other side of that table has any interest in relieving that suffering. Before we get to the final light, we need to sit with one more moment the film shows outright, one that rarely gets the clinical attention it deserves. The scene where Chris, already strapped to that leather chair, is forced to watch, on an old tube television, a tape recorded by Roman Armitage, calmly walking through the entire Coagula procedure step by step, like he's narrating a recipe. Chris is restrained, but still fully conscious, forced to listen to the exact script of what's about to happen to his own brain, minute by minute, word by word, unable to look away, unable to cover his ears, because his arms no longer answer to him. Imagine the sheer psychological terror of watching your own autopsy, explained in advance like an instructional video. That kind of exposure, knowing precisely what's coming with zero power to stop it, is recognized clinically as one of the strongest triggers for dissociative response in documented captivity situations, because the brain, knowing the pain is both inevitable and scheduled, starts building its mental escape route before the scalpel ever touches skin. This is the moment the real timeline actually falls apart. Look at the basement scene, Chris tearing stuffing out of that leather chair with his bare nails. That part is real, inside whatever version of events the film chooses to show us. The cotton he rips out and jams into his own ears is real too. A desperate physical act. A man trying to reclaim control over his own hearing, blocking the metal spoon, blocking the hypnotic trigger that's held him down. And it works, partially, just enough to break the shallow trance, enough to get up out of that chair, enough to bash Jeremy with the pool ball, enough to start moving through that house like a cornered animal. But watch closely what happens right after, because this is exactly where the seams of reality tear for good. Chris is wounded, exhausted, emotionally gutted after discovering that the woman he loved, Rose, always knew, always participated, was always the perfect bait in an operation that had already consumed dozens of bodies before his. A betrayal of that magnitude, stacked on top of physical exhaustion, stacked on top of the sedation Dean had already started prepping for the final surgery, creates exactly the storm neurologists describe as terminal dissociation. A state where a brain about to lose final motor control generates a vivid, sensorially complete, compensatory narrative to shield the core of the identity from the unbearable shock of its own extinction. Notice how, from this exact point forward, the events start following movie logic instead of survival logic. Chris, alone, wounded, up against an entire family of trained hunters, armed, with decades of hands-on experience running the Coagula procedure, somehow, with zero combat training, impales Dean Armitage on a mounted deer head, drops Jeremy with surgical precision, burns the entire house down, and still survives Missy's frenzied physical attack using nothing but his bare fingers. And after all of that, wounded, bleeding, in shock, he still has the motor clarity and emotional steadiness to drive a car down dark, unfamiliar roads. That is not the logic of real survival. That's the logic of catharsis. It's the brain, in its last gasp of conscious control, rewriting the real attackers, the surgeons, the anesthesiologists, Rose herself, as monsters that can be physically destroyed, when the actual attack happening in the real basement, on the real table, is silent, is surgical, done with a scalpel instead of a pool ball. Chris's mind takes the abstract, unbearable pain of being stolen from the inside and translates it into the only language it can process under extreme shock, the language of physical violence, of combat, of visible revenge. Think about Georgina. The most quietly terrifying moment in the entire film isn't a chase scene. It's the moment she looks at her own reflection in the car window and smiles. A smile that doesn't match whatever emotion she's actually feeling, only the programming steering her. And for 1 second, behind her eyes, something else surfaces, something that's begging, something suffering. That's the exact same pattern about to repeat with Chris, except his version never gets filmed, because the narrative shields the audience and shields Chris's own mind from the precise moment that same thing would happen to him too. There's a specific neurological reason the brain chooses revenge and fire as its final image over any other fantasy available. Fire means purification, total erasure, annihilation of the attacker, burning the Armitage house down, inside Chris's dying mind, is the symbolic equivalent of burning away the actual surgical procedure being performed on his real skull at that exact second. It's a desperate attempt to burn away the source of the pain before it becomes permanent. Which brings us to the cruelest moment of this entire breakdown. The roadside scene at night, Chris kneeling over Rose's fallen body, hearing sirens closing in. He raises his hands, his body already resigned to one more racial injustice, one more inevitable arrest, one more system that always saw him as a suspect before it ever saw him as a victim. And then the twist. The approaching car isn't a police cruiser, it's Rod. This exact kind of twist, an ending that feels too clean, too perfectly timed, too cinematic, isn't unique to this one film. Psychological cinema loves this device precisely because the human brain, under extreme, life-threatening stress, genuinely does this. Compressing time, exaggerating coincidence, manufacturing false rescue memories to soften an otherwise irreversible loss or death. Survivor accounts of near-death experiences frequently describe this exact pattern, a final, distorted perception, gentler and more heroic than the raw facts could ever justify. And Get Out borrows that same real psychological architecture to build the audience's false sense of relief. But look at what the camera actually shows in that exact moment. Spinning lights, cold, blue, and red, reflected across Chris's exhausted face. The film deliberately lets you assume those are squad car lights, only to subvert it with Rod's arrival. But that exact same visual description, cold spinning lights reflected directly into the eyes of someone lying still, motionless, surrendered, is also, clinically, the exact description of an operating room's surgical light. That relentless circular glow hanging above an operating table. The last visual stimulus a patient perceives right before anesthesia fully takes hold. Chris's dying brain captures that last stimulus of cold, spinning light and immediately fuses it with the one symbol of hope and rescue still available in memory. The face of his best friend, Rod, the only person who believed him from day one, the only one who suspected the truth hiding behind that mansion. And that's how the perfect rescue is born. Too cinematic to be real, constructed in the final seconds of conscious brain activity. One last act of mercy the mind offers itself before it disappears for good. If this theory has already changed the way you see that ending, drop your like right now and lock in your subscription here on the channel before the lights go out for good, because what's coming next is the hardest part of all. Because the real truth, the truth with no poetic filter, no narrative mercy, is this. While the credits roll, while the audience walks out of the theater relieved, exhaling, believing completely in Chris's victory, somewhere, in a real basement, on a real table, an old, wealthy white man, the winning bidder from that silent auction that opens the film, is finishing the process of waking up inside a young, healthy, athletic body. A body that was never his, but that now, legally, socially, physically, effectively is. That man is going to walk out of that house days later, smile at the neighbors, pick right back up with his old life inside a brand new body, walk down the street holding Rose's hand, both of them laughing at some throwaway joke, like nothing ever happened. Because for them, for the entire Armitage system, nothing wrong did happen. Just one more successful transaction. And Rose, especially Rose, is going to stay exactly the same, because that's where this gets even colder. She was never some naive victim manipulated by her own family. She's the single most efficient gear in the whole machine. The bait who's run this same seduction script so many times, she can recite the devoted girlfriend role with an almost bored fluency, scrolling old photos of past conquests while classical music plays quietly in her bedroom, with no visible guilt whatsoever, because to her, every new body is just one more successfully closed project in a family business she's never once questioned. And that's exactly why Chris's final fantasy has to kill her, has to strangle her with his own bare hands, because it's the only way his dying brain can symbolically express a truth his real body will never get the chance to act on, the truth that even far too late, there existed one single instant of complete recognition of the betrayal. And the real Chris, the Chris who felt fear, who felt love, whose childhood was shaped by losing his own mother, who carried the guilt of not calling for help in time, that Chris doesn't die. And that's the cruelest part of all of this. He doesn't get the mercy of death. He keeps existing, forever, compressed into some minimal fraction of awareness, inside the exact skull that now answers to someone else, seeing through his own eyes without controlling them, feeling his own body touch Rose without ever having asked for it, without ever having allowed it, screaming a scream no muscle will ever turn into sound, forever, at the bottom in the sunken place, forgotten by everyone, including, slowly, by himself. Think about the single most painful detail of all, one the film never has to show because the clinical logic delivers it on its own. As the months pass, the purchasing consciousness, now fully in motor command of that young body, keeps strengthening its own neural pathways inside that occupied territory, while the original fragment of Chris, isolated, unstimulated, unused, starts wasting away exactly like any tissue cut off from blood and oxygen. The awareness trapped in the sunken place doesn't die all at once. It atrophies slowly, losing sharpness, losing memories, losing its own name, until all that's left is a diffuse, faceless sense of suffocation, the last biological trace of an identity being erased one cell at a time from the inside out. And that's what makes this ending 1,000 times more terrifying than any conventional death horror has ever dared put on screen. There's no funeral, no body to bury, no possible grief for a family that will never learn the truth. There's only the grotesque continuity of a life still being lived, smiling in photos, celebrating birthdays, aging in apparent good health, while somewhere at the bottom of that same skull, a man has been screaming for years without a single person anywhere on Earth ever hearing it. Notice how every recurring object in this film, revisited under this lens, stops being set dressing and becomes a small, quiet monument. The porcelain teacup with the silver spoon, that sharp metallic clink that opens the door to the sunken place, stops being a simple hypnotic trigger and starts sounding, every time it appears, like a church bell announcing yet another silent funeral. The cotton Chris tears out of that chair. His desperate attempt to reclaim his own hearing stops being a survival trick and becomes the saddest symbol in the entire film, physical proof that he fought, that he tried, that his will existed and held on until the last available thread of strength, even if some deeper part of him already suspected it wouldn't be enough. And that mounted deer head on the basement wall, the hunting trophy hanging there like harmless decoration, reveals itself, by the end, as the cruelest mirror of all. Because that's exactly what Chris always was to that family. A selected animal, patiently hunted, displayed as a prize, and eventually processed down to nothing but a beautiful carcass hanging on the wall of the life someone else now gets to live. And maybe the most uncomfortable question here isn't really about the movie at all. It's about us, about why we need, so badly, so urgently, for Chris to survive. Because an ending where the black protagonist of this story dies, or worse, gets erased from the inside while his body keeps smiling for the world, is such an unbearable ending, sitting so close to real historical patterns of exploitation and dehumanization that the audience itself, collectively, needs some kind of emotional release valve. And Jordan Peele, who reportedly wrote an earlier, darker draft of this ending before ultimately choosing the version that made it to theaters, clearly understood the full weight of that choice. The version you watched on screen is the version the market, the audience, the industry were ready to sit with. But the internal logic of the story itself, the impossible timing, the surgical light disguised as sirens, the revenge that's too cathartic to be real, keeps whispering underneath the surface a much older, much harder truth that no audience would ever want to admit out loud. Even the film's title works against you here, once you notice it. Get out sounds like an instruction, a warning shouted at the screen. The kind of line horror audiences love yelling at a character making a bad decision. But by the end, once you understand what actually happens on that table, the title stops being a warning and starts sounding like the one thing that was never going to be possible. Nobody gets out of that basement. Nobody gets out of that chair. The title isn't advice. It's a wish, whispered by a mind that already knows, somewhere underneath the sedation, that it's the one instruction it will never get to follow. This, and only this, is the real ending of Get Out. There is no escape. There is no revenge. There is no Rod arriving just in time. There is only a man, conscious forever, trapped inside his own stolen body, watching his own life get lived by somebody else, unable even to close his own eyes to look away. And before you close this video, sit with this for one more second. How many other happy endings you've watched, cheered for, celebrated, were also, quietly, just the last gentle lie a dying mind told itself, in the exact instant everything, for real, was already over. Think about it the next time you rewatch Get Out. The second Rod opens that car door, the second Chris exhales in the passenger seat, the second the score softens, and the city lights promise some kind of return to normal life. Just try, for 1 second, to sit with the uncomfortable possibility that you're not watching a movie end at all. You're watching the last flicker of electrical activity inside a brain that is, at that precise millisecond, being permanently switched off, replaced, silenced. Because that's the cruelest nature of any well-built psychological defense mechanism. It never feels like a lie while it's happening. It feels, to the mind living it, like the most real, most relieving thing that mind has ever experienced. And that's exactly why the real horror of Get Out was never in the chase, never in the knife, never in the fire. The real horror was always hiding inside the relief you personally felt, sitting on your couch, the second you believed, even for 1 second, that Chris had actually made it out.